Both pilots collapsed at 31,000 feet. No one could fly the plane. Passengers screamed. Flight attendants panicked. Then a 12-year-old girl stood up. Adults tried to stop her. She locked herself in the cockpit. Everyone thought they would die. But she had a secret no one knew. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 737 leveled off at 31,000 feet over the Nevada desert, and 12-year-old Maya Santos settled deeper into her window seat in row 14, her noise-canceling headphones creating a bubble of silence around her as the aircraft reached its cruising altitude. The flight attendants had checked on her 3 times already during the climb from Phoenix, each time speaking in that particular tone adults reserved for unaccompanied minors, asking if she needed anything with exaggerated cheerfulness that made her feel even younger than her actual age. She'd smiled politely each time, assured them she was fine, and returned her attention to the aviation manual hidden inside the cover of a teen magazine, careful not to let anyone see what she was really reading. The elderly woman in the aisle seat had offered her gum and asked about school with grandmotherly concern, clearly viewing Maya as just another child traveling alone who might need adult supervision or comfort during the flight. The businessman across the aisle had glanced at her tablet screen earlier when she'd been reviewing cockpit procedures, but he'd only seen what appeared to be a flight simulator game, shaking his head slightly at another kid wasting time on electronic entertainment rather than reading a proper book or doing homework. Maya's backpack under the seat contained the usual items any 12-year-old might carry when traveling to visit relatives: snacks her aunt had packed, a stuffed animal she was honestly too old for but couldn't bear to leave behind, schoolbooks for the homework she'd promised her teacher she'd complete over the weekend, and her father's old pilot logbook that she'd smuggled into her carry-on without telling anyone. None of the adults around her, not the flight attendants who'd escorted her through security and settled her into her seat with careful instructions about seatbelts and bathroom locations, not the gate agent who'd checked her paperwork and assured her everything would be fine, not the captain who'd briefly stopped by her seat before takeoff to introduce himself and tell her they'd take good care of her. None of them had any idea that she'd spent the past 2 years since her father's death absorbing every piece of aviation knowledge she could find. Her dad had been a commercial pilot for 17 years before the cancer took him, and in those final months when he was too weak to fly but too stubborn to stop teaching, he transferred everything he knew to his only daughter, making her promise she'd remember it all, never imagining she might actually need to use it one day. The cockpit voice recorder would later show that Captain Richard Hayes and First Officer Jennifer Morrison had been discussing their lunch orders 43 minutes into the flight when the first symptoms appeared. Hayes mentioned feeling slightly dizzy, attributed it to not drinking enough water that morning, and Morrison agreed she felt oddly lightheaded as well, though neither pilot immediately recognized the danger. The catering company that had provided the crew meals at Phoenix Sky Harbor had unknowingly served contaminated seafood pasta to both pilots, and the aggressive bacterial toxins were now flooding their systems with terrifying speed. Within 90 seconds of the first symptoms, both pilots were experiencing severe neurological effects, their vision blurring as their hands became clumsy on the controls. Hayes tried to radio air traffic control but couldn't form the words properly, his tongue thick and unresponsive as Morrison slumped forward against her harness, consciousness slipping away like water through her fingers. The autopilot continued flying the aircraft straight and level at 31,000 feet while both pilots lost their battle with the toxins and collapsed completely, leaving Flight 2847 with 163 souls aboard and absolutely no one conscious in the cockpit to fly it. Senior flight attendant Patricia Hoffman was serving drinks in first class when she noticed the cockpit door hadn't opened in over an hour, which violated the airline's strict security protocols requiring periodic checks and crew rotation. She knocked twice using the standard pattern, waited for the response that never came, then used her emergency access code to unlock the door, expecting to find the pilots simply too focused on their instruments to hear her knocking. What she found instead made her blood turn to ice in her veins. Both pilots were unconscious. Captain Hayes slumped sideways in his seat with foam at the corners of his mouth, First Officer Morrison hanging forward against her shoulder harness with her eyes rolled back showing only whites. The instrument panels glowed with normal indications, autopilot engaged and holding the aircraft steady, but there was no one conscious to monitor the systems or respond to any emergencies that might develop. Patricia's hands shook as she checked both pilots for pulses, found them alive but deeply unconscious and completely unresponsive to her attempts to wake them, and realized with absolute horror that she was looking at a situation that shouldn't be possible but was happening right now at 31,000 feet with over 100 passengers depending on someone flying this aircraft to safety. She backed out of the cockpit on trembling legs and grabbed her colleague Marcus' chin, keeping her voice low and controlled despite the panic clawing at her throat as she explained what she'd found. Marcus looked at her like she'd lost her mind, insisted she must be mistaken because both pilots couldn't possibly be unconscious simultaneously, but when she dragged him to the cockpit and he saw the situation for himself, the color drained from his face so completely he looked like he might collapse. 2. They had protocols for single-pilot incapacitation, procedures they drilled dozens of times in training, but nothing in their manuals covered what to do when both pilots were down and there was literally no one qualified to fly the aircraft. Patricia's mind raced through their passenger manifest, desperately trying to remember if anyone had listed pilot experience in their frequent flyer profiles, but she came up empty, and even if there was a private pilot somewhere in the cabin, getting them up to speed on a commercial aircraft they'd never flown before while dealing with 2 incapacitated crew members seemed impossible. The announcement Patricia made over the intercom started calmly enough, asking if there were any pilots or people with flight experience aboard, but her voice cracked on the last words and passengers immediately sensed something was catastrophically wrong. Within seconds the cabin erupted into chaos as people demanded to know what was happening, parents pulled their children close, and several passengers began openly praying as the reality of their situation became terrifyingly clear. A retired Air Force navigator rushed forward to help, but when he saw the modern glass cockpit with its digital displays and computer systems so different from the aircraft he'd flown decades ago, he admitted with devastating honesty that he had no idea how to operate these systems and trying to fly an aircraft he didn't understand would probably kill everyone faster than doing nothing. 3 people claimed to have flight simulator experience, but when Patricia questioned them closely, they admitted they'd only played games on their computers, never trained on actual aircraft systems or emergency procedures, and their confidence evaporated when confronted with the real cockpit where one wrong input could send them into an unrecoverable dive. Maya heard the announcement and felt something cold and heavy settle into her stomach as she understood what was happening with terrible clarity. Her father's voice echoed in her memory from one of their last conversations, when he'd made her practice emergency procedures on his home simulator over and over until she could execute them perfectly with her eyes closed. He'd told her that knowledge was responsibility, that if she learned these things she might someday be the only person in a position to help, and she'd have to find the courage to act even if everyone around her doubted her abilities. She'd been 10 years old then and thought he was just being dramatic, trying to make their training sessions feel more important than they were, but now she understood he'd been preparing her for exactly this moment. Every hour she'd spent studying his manuals, every simulation she'd run through, every procedure he'd drilled into her until it became muscle memory, all of it had been leading to this terrifying instant where she had to choose between staying silent in her seat like a good child or stepping forward to do something that would seem absolutely insane to every adult on this aircraft. She unbuckled her seatbelt with fingers that wanted to shake but didn't, pulled her father's logbook from her backpack like a talisman, and walked toward the front of the aircraft with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The elderly woman called after her asking where she was going, concern in her voice for the unaccompanied minor wandering the cabin during an emergency, but Maya didn't stop or explain because she knew any explanation would sound like the desperate fantasy of a scared child. Patricia was blocking the cockpit entrance, coordinating with the navigator and 2 flight attendants while trying to raise air traffic control on the intercom, when Maya approached and said in a voice that barely shook that she could fly the aircraft. Patricia looked down at her with an expression mixing pity and frustration, told her gently that this wasn't a game and she needed to return to her seat immediately, but Maya stood her ground and explained about her father, about the training, about the hours she'd logged on commercial aircraft simulators that were far more sophisticated than simple games. Patricia's first instinct was to dismiss her completely, to have Marcus escort this child back to her seat and keep her there, because the idea of letting a 12-year-old girl into the cockpit during a crisis was so absurd it didn't merit consideration. But something in Maya's eyes, a steadiness and focus that seemed far too mature for her age, made Patricia hesitate and actually listen to what she was saying. The girl was describing cockpit procedures with technical accuracy, using terminology that shouldn't be in any child's vocabulary, referencing specific emergency protocols that weren't public knowledge but were taught to commercial pilots during their training. The retired navigator leaned in to listen, asked Maya several pointed questions about aircraft systems and emergency procedures, and his expression shifted from skepticism to shock as she answered each one correctly with the kind of detail that only came from serious study and understanding. He looked at Patricia and said quietly that the kid knew things she shouldn't know, that her answers were too specific and accurate to be lucky guesses, and maybe they should at least let her try because their other options were exactly zero. Patricia made a decision that would haunt her nightmares for years regardless of how this ended, stepping aside to let a child enter the cockpit while 163 lives hung in the balance. Maya walked past the unconscious pilots to the center console, her hands small against the controls that had been designed for adult pilots, and felt the weight of everyone's survival settle onto her shoulders like a physical burden. She could hear passengers arguing behind her, voices raised in panic and disbelief that they were trusting their lives to a kid, and she knew she had maybe 30 seconds before the adults' fear overcame their desperation and they tried to pull her away from the controls. Her father's final lesson echoed in her mind, his weak voice from his hospital bed telling her that in a real emergency she might have to make hard choices, might have to protect herself from people who wouldn't understand she was trying to help, and she'd have to find the strength to do what was necessary even if it seemed cruel. Maya reached up and engaged the cockpit door lock, the heavy mechanism sliding into place with a solid thunk that cut off the cabin noise and sealed her inside with the unconscious pilots and the aircraft's fate. Patricia's voice immediately came through the intercom demanding she unlock the door, panic evident now as she realized what the child had done, but Maya ignored her and focused on the radio instead, keying the mic with shaking hands as she prepared to make contact with air traffic control. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected when she transmitted, identifying the flight number and stating clearly that both pilots were incapacitated and she was a 12-year-old passenger with aviation training attempting to take control of the aircraft. The controller's response was immediate and professional, his tone shifting from routine to emergency protocols as he processed what she'd said, and she heard him conferring with supervisors in the background before he came back on frequency with instructions to stand by while they got resources mobilized. The pounding on the cockpit door intensified as passengers realized a child had locked herself in and was claiming she could fly the aircraft, their fear manifesting as anger and demands that she let trained adults handle the situation. Maya understood their reaction, knew that from their perspective she looked like a panicked kid making everything worse, but she also knew that opening that door would mean chaos flooding into the cockpit, well-meaning adults trying to take controls they didn't understand, and everyone dying in the resulting confusion. Her father had taught her that sometimes saving people meant protecting them from their own panic, even if they hated you for it, and she'd made her choice the moment she locked that door. The controller came back on frequency with a supervisor now, a senior air traffic controller named Robert Chen who'd handled in-flight emergencies for 23 years and never encountered anything remotely like this situation. He spoke to Maya with careful calm, treating her as a pilot rather than a child, asking her to read off the aircraft's current altitude, heading, speed, and fuel state so they could assess their situation and begin planning her approach. Maya scanned the instruments with eyes that had memorized every display on her father's simulator, calling out the numbers with precision as she noted they were at 31,000 feet, heading 270 at 480 knots, with fuel showing 6,000 pounds remaining. Robert acknowledged her report and told her they were going to take this one step at a time, that the first priority was getting the aircraft down to a lower altitude where the air was thicker and any problems would be more manageable, and he was going to walk her through a gradual descent that would be smooth and controlled. He asked if she'd ever performed a descent procedure before, and Maya responded that she'd done it hundreds of times on her father's simulator, though never in an actual aircraft, and Robert told her that was good enough because the principles were identical and he'd be with her every step of the way. The descent procedure Robert outlined was methodical and conservative, designed to minimize any chance of Maya making a mistake that could put the aircraft into an unrecoverable situation. He instructed her to disengage the autopilot's altitude hold, which would allow her to manually command a descent, then set the vertical speed to -1,000 feet per minute, which would bring them down gradually without creating uncomfortable sensations for the passengers or stressing the aircraft's structure. Maya's hand hovered over the autopilot controls, her father's warnings about autopilot mode confusion echoing in her memory, and she carefully followed Robert's instructions exactly as given, feeling the aircraft's nose drop slightly as they began descending toward lower altitude. The rate of descent was gentle, barely noticeable, but Maya watched the altitude indicator begin counting down and felt a surge of relief that she'd managed the first step without killing everyone through some terrible error in judgment. Robert kept talking to her throughout the descent, his voice a constant anchor of calm authority that helped Maya focus on the tasks rather than the terror trying to claw its way up from her stomach. He asked her about her training, how long she'd been studying aviation, what her father had taught her about emergency procedures, and Maya found herself describing those final months with her dad in between altitude callouts, explaining how he'd made her practice every possible failure scenario until she could handle them instinctively. Robert told her that her father had given her an incredible gift, that the training she'd received was more comprehensive than many professional pilots got, and she should trust that preparation now because it was clearly solid and reliable. Behind her Maya could hear the flight attendants trying to communicate through the intercom, their voices urgent as they explained that passengers were becoming increasingly agitated, demanding to know why a child was flying the aircraft and threatening to break down the cockpit door if she didn't surrender control immediately. Maya ignored the threats and focused on flying, calling out their passing altitude as they descended through 25,000 feet with the autopilot holding them steady and the aircraft responding perfectly to her commands. Robert introduced her to another voice on frequency, a commercial airline captain named Sarah Martinez who'd been pulled from her day off to help talk Maya through the landing phase, and Sarah's first words were to tell Maya she was doing an absolutely incredible job and should be very proud of how professionally she was handling this emergency. Sarah asked Maya detailed questions about her simulator training, what aircraft types she'd practiced on, whether she'd done any actual landings, and Maya admitted that while she'd practiced hundreds of landings on her father's 737 simulator she'd never touched real controls before today. Sarah told her that was actually good news because the simulator training would translate directly to the actual aircraft, the controls would respond exactly as she expected them to, and muscle memory from all those practice sessions would kick in when she needed it most. The descent continued smoothly as they passed 15,000 feet, and Robert instructed Maya to begin slowing the aircraft by reducing the throttle settings gradually, bringing their speed down from cruising velocity to something more appropriate for approach and landing. Maya found the throttle levers exactly where her father's simulator had positioned them, pulled them back incrementally while monitoring the speed indicator, and felt a quiet satisfaction as the aircraft slowed precisely as predicted. Without any uncomfortable deceleration for the passengers. Sarah praised her throttle work, told her she was flying as smoothly as pilots with thousands of hours of experience, and Maya felt some of the crushing fear ease slightly as she began to believe she might actually be capable of saving everyone. The fuel quantity was decreasing as expected, still showing adequate reserves for a landing, and Maya reported this to Robert who confirmed they had more than enough fuel to reach Las Vegas McCarran International where emergency equipment was being positioned for her arrival. Patricia's voice came through the intercom again, more controlled now, reporting that the unconscious pilots were still breathing but showed no signs of regaining consciousness, and asking if Maya needed any assistance with the controls or if there was anything the cabin crew could do to help. Maya told her to keep passengers seated and calm, to prepare them for a potentially rough landing, and to make sure everyone understood that despite her age she'd been trained for exactly this situation by a commercial pilot who'd made emergency preparedness his final mission. Patricia's response was shaky but supportive, saying she'd do her best to keep the cabin under control, and Maya heard her making an announcement explaining that the young pilot had extensive training and was working directly with air traffic control to bring them home safely. The pounding on the cockpit door had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that Maya found almost more unnerving than the anger, and she wondered if the passengers had accepted their situation or were simply too terrified to react anymore. Robert brought her attention back to the immediate task, instructing her to level off at 10,000 feet and begin configuring the aircraft for approach, which meant extending flaps and landing gear at appropriate speeds to prepare for touchdown. Maya acknowledged the instruction and began the leveling procedure, reducing her descent rate gradually until the altitude indicator stabilized at exactly 10,000 feet, and Sarah talked her through the flap extension sequence that would increase lift and allow the aircraft to fly more slowly without stalling. The flap lever was a large handle on the center console, and Maya moved it to the first position as instructed, feeling the aircraft's nose pitch up slightly as the wing configuration changed and additional drag slowed their speed. Sarah told her she was doing perfectly, that the flap extension was textbook smooth, and they'd continue configuring the aircraft step by step until she was ready for final approach. The Las Vegas airport was now visible in the distance, a sprawling complex of runways and terminals that looked both reassuringly large and terrifyingly complicated from 30 miles out. Robert gave Maya vectors to fly, specific headings that would line her up with runway 26 left, which was the longest available and offered the best chance for a safe landing even if her touchdown was less than perfect. Maya adjusted the autopilot heading selector to match Robert's instructions, the aircraft banking smoothly into each turn as she maneuvered toward the approach course, and she felt a strange calm settling over her as the procedures became automatic and her training took control. Sarah asked her to extend the next flap setting and reduce speed further, bringing them down to 190 knots, which was appropriate for the aircraft's current configuration, and Maya executed the changes with hands that had stopped shaking and a focus that blocked out everything except the instruments and the voices guiding her home. The landing gear extension was the next critical step, and Sarah warned Maya that she'd feel and hear significant vibration and noise when the massive wheels dropped into the slipstream, but this was completely normal and nothing to be alarmed about. Maya positioned her hand on the gear lever, a large handle with a wheel-shaped grip that she'd practiced operating countless times on the simulator, and pulled it down decisively when Sarah gave the word. The aircraft shuddered as 3 sets of wheels extended into the airflow, a loud mechanical grinding filling the cockpit as hydraulic systems forced the gear into locked position, and 3 green lights illuminated on the instrument panel confirming that all landing gear was down and secured. Maya reported the 3 green lights to Sarah, who congratulated her on another perfect procedure, and Robert updated her position relative to the airport, telling her she was now 12 miles from the runway and perfectly aligned for final approach. The final flap setting came next, extending the wing surfaces to their maximum position for landing, and Maya moved the flap lever to the final detent while adjusting throttle to maintain proper approach speed. The aircraft was now configured exactly as it should be for landing, gear down, flaps extended, speed stabilized at 140 knots, and Maya felt a surge of confidence that maybe, just maybe, she could actually do this impossible thing her father had unknowingly prepared her to do. Sarah's voice took on a more serious tone as she explained that the landing phase would require Maya's complete focus, that she'd need to disconnect the autopilot and fly manually to touch down on the runway, and while this would feel different from the autopilot's smooth control, Maya had done this successfully many times before and her muscle memory would guide her through it. Maya acknowledged with a voice that sounded far calmer than she felt, her hands moving to the control yoke as she prepared to take direct command of the aircraft for the first time. Robert cleared her for final approach to runway 26 left, and Maya saw the runway ahead of her, a long strip of concrete growing larger as they descended on the glide path. Sarah talked her through the autopilot disconnect procedure, and suddenly Maya was hand-flying a Boeing 737 at 140 knots with the ground rising to meet her and 163 lives depending on her getting this exactly right. The control yoke felt alive in her hands, sensitive to every tiny input, and she made small corrections to keep the runway centerline aligned with her nose as turbulence from the desert heat tried to push them off course. Sarah told her she was doing beautifully, that her corrections were smooth and appropriate, and to continue exactly as she was doing while focusing on the runway threshold that would be her aiming point for touchdown. Maya's world narrowed to the instruments, the runway, and Sarah's calm voice providing constant guidance and encouragement as they descended through 500 feet with the ground rushing up beneath them. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold at exactly the right altitude and speed, and Sarah instructed Maya to gradually reduce throttle to idle while raising the nose slightly to slow their descent rate for touchdown. Maya pulled the throttles back smoothly, felt the aircraft sink toward the runway, and raised the nose just as her father had taught her, holding the aircraft in a gentle flare while gravity and reduced lift brought them down those final few feet. The main landing gear touched the concrete with a solid thump that was harder than a professional landing but far from dangerous, and Maya immediately moved the throttle levers into reverse thrust position as she'd practiced countless times, the engines roaring as they worked to slow the massive aircraft. The nose gear settled onto the runway seconds later, and Maya applied gentle pressure to the brake pedals while keeping the aircraft tracking straight down the centerline, reverse thrust and wheel brakes working together to bleed off speed as they rolled down the runway. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles were racing alongside the aircraft as Maya brought them to a complete stop on the runway, their lights flashing in the afternoon sun, and she heard Sarah's voice choked with emotion telling her she'd done it. She'd actually saved every single person aboard with a landing that would have made her father incredibly proud. Maya sat frozen in the pilot's seat, her hands still gripping the control yoke, as the enormity of what she'd just accomplished crashed over her like a wave. Robert was back on frequency telling her that emergency crews were approaching to secure the aircraft and evacuate passengers, that medical teams were standing by to treat the incapacitated pilots, and that she needed to set the parking brake and shut down the engines following the procedures her father had surely taught her. Maya's hands moved through the shutdown sequence mechanically, muscle memory executing the steps while her conscious mind struggled to process that she'd actually landed a commercial aircraft at 12 years old and everyone had survived. The cockpit door unlocked with a heavy clunk as Maya disengaged the security system, and Patricia burst through seconds later with tears streaming down her face, pulling Maya into a fierce hug while thanking her over and over for saving all their lives. The passengers were evacuating down emergency slides as per protocol, and through the cockpit windows Maya could see medical teams rushing aboard to attend to Captain Hayes and First Officer Morrison who were being carefully extracted from their seats on stretchers. The retired navigator appeared in the cockpit doorway, his weathered face showing a complex mixture of emotions as he told Maya he'd seen a lot of flying in his career but never witnessed courage like what she'd just displayed, and her father would have been bursting with pride at how perfectly she'd executed everything under impossible pressure. The aftermath unfolded in a blur of activity as Maya was escorted from the aircraft by paramedics who wanted to check her for shock despite her insistence that she was fine. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing footage of the 12-year-old girl being helped down the emergency slide by flight attendants while emergency crews swarmed the aircraft behind her. Passengers who'd been terrified and angry about a child taking the controls now surrounded her with gratitude and amazement, parents thanking her through tears for saving their children, businessmen who doubted her abilities now shaking her hand and apologizing for not trusting her judgment. The elderly woman from her row found her in the chaos and wrapped her in a grandmother's embrace, telling her she'd never been so wrong about anyone in her life and Maya was the bravest person she'd ever met regardless of age. Federal aviation investigators descended on the scene within hours, beginning the complex process of documenting every detail of the incident for their official report. They interviewed Maya extensively about her training, her decision-making process, her execution of the emergency landing, and they reviewed the cockpit voice recorder which captured every moment from the pilot's initial symptoms through Maya's perfect touchdown. The lead investigator, a grizzled veteran of 30 years examining aviation accidents, told the assembled press that Maya's actions represented some of the finest emergency airmanship he'd encountered in his entire career, that her decision to lock the cockpit door had likely saved lives by preventing panic from interfering with critical procedures, and her landing would be studied as a textbook example of proper technique under extreme pressure. Captain Hayes and First Officer Morrison were hospitalized with severe food poisoning that would ground them for weeks but would cause no permanent damage, and both pilots sent messages to Maya thanking her for saving their lives and the lives of everyone aboard their aircraft. The story exploded across every news outlet on the planet, the incredible tale of a 12-year-old girl who'd locked herself in the cockpit and landed a commercial aircraft after both pilots collapsed at 31,000 feet. Aviation experts appeared on television to explain how remarkable her accomplishment was, that landing a Boeing 737 required skills most professional pilots trained for years to master, and for a child to execute it flawlessly on her first attempt defied belief. Her father's story emerged as reporters investigated her background, learning about the dying pilot who'd spent his final months teaching his daughter everything he knew, and the narrative of preparation meeting opportunity in the most dramatic possible way captured the world's imagination. Maya found herself thrust into a spotlight she'd never wanted, fielding interview requests from media around the globe, all wanting to hear her describe those terrifying minutes when she decided to take control and save everyone despite knowing how insane it looked to the adults around her. The Federal Aviation Administration faced difficult questions about how to classify Maya's actions, whether her unauthorized operation of a commercial aircraft violated regulations, and what precedent her successful landing set for future emergencies. They ultimately declined to pursue any enforcement action, releasing a statement praising her heroism while emphasizing that her situation was extraordinarily unique and should not encourage untrained individuals to attempt flying aircraft in emergencies. Airlines updated their crew incapacitation protocols to include provisions for situations where passengers might have relevant expertise, creating frameworks for evaluating and potentially utilizing civilian pilots or trained individuals during catastrophic emergencies. Flight attendant training programs added scenarios based on Maya's experience, teaching cabin crews how to identify passengers with aviation knowledge and how to make rapid decisions about unconventional solutions when conventional options had been exhausted. Maya returned to school 3 weeks after the incident to find herself treated as a celebrity, her classmates viewing her with awe and her teachers struggling to process that this quiet student who'd always been diligent but unremarkable had saved 163 lives through skills none of them knew she possessed. She found the attention overwhelming and uncomfortable, preferring to remember her father rather than discuss her 15 minutes of fame, but she also understood that her story had inspired people around the world to take aviation safety more seriously and to recognize that age didn't necessarily determine capability in crisis situations. Her father's old flight school established a scholarship in his name for young aviation enthusiasts, and Maya became the first recipient, using the funds to pursue formal pilot training that would eventually lead to her becoming one of the youngest commercially licensed pilots in aviation history. The passengers of Flight 2847 formed a survivors group that stayed in contact through social media, sharing their ongoing gratitude for the child who'd refused to accept that their situation was hopeless. They met annually on the anniversary of the emergency landing, gathering at the Las Vegas airport to commemorate their survival and to celebrate Maya's courage in taking action when every adult aboard had been paralyzed by disbelief and fear. Many credited the experience with changing their perspectives on life, teaching them that assumptions about age and capability could be dangerously limiting, and that sometimes the most unlikely person in any situation might be the one with the knowledge and courage necessary to save everyone. The elderly woman from row 14 became a surrogate grandmother to Maya, checking in regularly and attending her high school graduation years later with tears of pride for the remarkable young woman the frightened 12-year-old had become. Captain Hayes and First Officer Morrison recovered fully from their food poisoning and returned to flying after extensive medical evaluation, but both carried with them a profound appreciation for the fragility of safety and the importance of thorough emergency training. They reached out to Maya when she began her formal pilot training, offering to mentor her and share their decades of experience, and a unique bond formed between the pilots whose lives she'd saved and the young aviator following in her father's footsteps. Hayes told her that he'd spent his entire career preparing for emergencies he'd never faced, and watching a 12-year-old execute perfect procedures under unthinkable pressure had reminded him why that preparation mattered, because you never knew when the impossible situation would become reality and training would be the only thing standing between survival and tragedy. Sarah Martinez, the captain who talked Maya through the landing, became a vocal advocate for youth aviation education, using Maya's story to promote programs that introduce children to flying and technical knowledge at young ages. She argued that Maya's success hadn't been luck or natural talent but the result of dedicated training by a parent who'd taken education seriously, and that more children with access to quality aviation instruction could develop similar capabilities that might prove invaluable in future emergencies. Flight schools across the country reported surges in enrollment from young students inspired by Maya's example, and aviation organizations developed youth programs specifically designed to teach emergency procedures and aircraft operations to teenagers interested in pursuing flying careers. The psychological impact of the emergency lingered for Maya long after the media attention faded and life attempted to return to normal. She experienced recurring nightmares about the moment she'd locked the cockpit door, dreams where she made different choices and everyone died because she'd hesitated or listened to the adults telling her she was just a child. A trauma counselor helped her process the enormous burden she'd carried that day, the weight of 163 lives depending on her not making a single mistake, and the aftermath of being thrust into a situation no child should ever face. The counselor explained that while her actions had been heroic, the experience of that level of responsibility at such a young age would affect her in ways she'd need to understand and address as she continued to grow and develop. Maya's relationship with aviation became more complex after the emergency, no longer the simple connection to her father's memory but now entangled with trauma and responsibility and public expectation. She struggled with whether to pursue professional flying, questioning if she'd ever be able to sit in a cockpit without remembering those terrifying minutes at 31,000 feet when everything had hung in the balance. Her therapist encouraged her to take time, to explore aviation on her own terms rather than feeling obligated to follow a path because of what she'd accomplished, and to remember that her father's gift of knowledge had been exactly that, a gift, not a mandate for her future. Eventually Maya decided to pursue her commercial pilot's license, but on a timeline that felt right for her rather than rushing to capitalize on her fame or prove something to a watching world. The changes to aviation safety protocols that emerged from Maya's emergency extended beyond just procedures for pilot incapacitation. Airlines implemented more rigorous controls on crew meals, ensuring that pilots never ate the same food and that catering sources were carefully monitored for contamination risks. The dual pilot incapacitation scenario that had seemed impossibly unlikely became a recognized threat requiring specific mitigation strategies, and aircraft manufacturers began developing systems that could assist untrained operators in landing aircraft during emergencies when no qualified pilots were available. Maya consulted on several of these projects, her unique perspective as someone who'd successfully landed an aircraft with minimal formal training providing valuable insights into what information and guidance an emergency operator would need most. Years later, when Maya stood at her commercial pilot graduation ceremony at age 19, becoming one of the youngest certified airline pilots in the country, she thought about that terrifying afternoon over Nevada when she'd had to choose between staying silent or stepping forward to attempt something that seemed impossible. Her father had taught her that knowledge carried responsibility, that learning something meant accepting you might need to use it when others couldn't, and she'd lived that lesson in the most extreme way imaginable. The other graduates celebrated their achievement with joy and relief, but Maya felt something more complicated, a recognition that she'd already faced the worst emergency most pilots would encounter in entire careers, and everything that came after would be measured against those moments when she'd been 12 years old and flying for everyone's lives. The media still occasionally contacted her for anniversary pieces or updates on where the miracle child pilot was now, but Maya had learned to control her narrative and share only what she felt comfortable revealing. She spoke publicly about the importance of aviation education, about her father's legacy, about the need for better emergency protocols, but she kept private the nightmares that still sometimes woke her, the therapy sessions that helped her process survivor's guilt she felt about being praised for something that had terrified her, and the complex emotions around being defined by one extraordinary day when she'd been forced to become someone she wasn't ready to be. Her story had inspired thousands of young people to pursue aviation, had changed safety protocols that would protect future passengers, and had demonstrated that capability wasn't determined by age but by training, preparation, and courage when it mattered most. The elderly woman from row 14, whose name was Margaret Hartley, attended Maya's graduation with tears streaming down her weathered face, remembering the frightened child who'd walked past her toward the cockpit with determination in her eyes. She told anyone who'd listened that she'd witnessed true heroism that day, not the kind that came from physical strength or fearlessness, but the kind that came from doing what needed to be done despite being absolutely terrified, from trusting your training when everyone around you doubted, and from accepting responsibility far beyond what anyone your age should carry. Margaret had become a fixture in Maya's life, attending school events and graduations, celebrating birthdays, and providing the grandmother presents Maya had lost when her own grandmother had passed before her father's death. The final piece of Maya's story, the one that brought everything full circle, came when she was assigned her first commercial flight as a certified first officer. The captain she'd be flying with was none other than Jennifer Morrison, the pilot who'd been unconscious in the right seat during Maya's emergency landing years before. Morrison shook Maya's hand in the crew briefing room with emotion visible in her eyes, telling her it was an honor to finally fly together properly, and that she'd followed Maya's journey through flight school with interest and pride. They flew together flawlessly, two professionals executing procedures with precision, and when they landed smoothly at their destination, Morrison told Maya that watching her operate the aircraft with such skill and confidence made her understand that the terrified 12-year-old who'd saved her life had truly become the pilot she'd been meant to be all along. Maya's father had told her during their final conversations that aviation was about preparation meeting opportunity, about training until procedures became instinct, and about finding courage to act when action was required. He'd prepared her for an emergency he'd never imagined she'd face, given her knowledge he'd hoped she'd never need to use, and created a legacy that extended far beyond the lives of the 163 people aboard Flight 2847. Every young pilot inspired by Maya's story, every safety protocol updated because of her experience, every family that survived future emergencies because procedures had been improved, all of it flowed from a dying pilot's final gift to his daughter, and her choice to use that gift when staying silent would have been easier and safer and more age-appropriate. The placard mounted in the Aviation Museum in Las Vegas told the story in simple terms: 12-year-old passenger saved 163 lives by landing commercial aircraft after both pilots collapsed, youngest person in history to successfully land a Boeing 737, changed aviation safety protocols worldwide. But Maya knew the real story was more complicated, about a father's love expressed through rigorous training, about a child's decision to take responsibility far beyond her years, about the adults who trusted her despite their doubts, and about the moment when all that preparation had mattered in ways no one could have predicted. She'd been forced to grow up in the span of those terrifying minutes from Phoenix to Las Vegas, transformed from a child into someone who'd held lives in her hands and brought them all home safely. The recurring question Maya faced in interviews and speaking engagements was whether she'd do it again, whether, knowing the psychological toll and the burden of that day, she'd still choose to lock that cockpit door and take those controls. Her answer never changed: she hadn't really had a choice, not in any meaningful sense, because once she'd understood the situation and recognized that she alone possessed the knowledge to possibly save everyone, walking away would have meant watching 163 people die when she might have prevented it. That wasn't a choice anyone could make, regardless of age, and her father's training had given her not just the technical skills but the moral framework to understand that knowledge created obligation. She'd been 12 years old and terrified and completely unprepared for the responsibility, but she'd also been the only person aboard that aircraft capable of flying it, and that single fact had made every other consideration irrelevant. The legacy of Flight 2847's emergency landing continued evolving years after Maya had graduated from pilot training and begun her professional career. Aviation psychologists studied her decision-making process as an example of effective crisis management under extreme pressure, noting how she'd correctly assessed that adult panic represented a greater threat than her own inexperience. Safety experts examined her choice to lock the cockpit door, initially controversial but ultimately recognized as the action that prevented well-meaning interference from creating fatal confusion during critical phases of flight. Her story became required reading in crew resource management courses, teaching professional pilots about recognizing and utilizing all available resources during emergencies, including passengers whose capabilities might not be immediately obvious. Maya Santos, who'd been an ordinary 12-year-old girl studying her father's aviation manuals in secret, had become a symbol of preparation's importance, courage's necessity, and the reality that age didn't determine capability when training met emergency. The little girl who'd locked herself in the cockpit while terrified adults pounded on the door had trusted her dead father's teaching more than the living adult's panic, and that trust had saved everyone aboard. Her father had given her knowledge as a gift, never expecting it would be tested so dramatically, and she'd honored that gift by using it when using it meant risking everything on skills she'd only practiced in simulation. The story that had seemed impossible when it happened, too incredible to be believed, had become aviation history's reminder that heroes could emerge from the most unlikely places when preparation, courage, and desperate necessity aligned in perfect crisis.